All right, welcome everybody to Webinar 1. Today we're going to talk about LGBT people in the military, a little bit about World War II and Lavender Scare and how that all fits together. Hopefully that provides you with some background for what you teach and how you do it. I'm Rob Darrow and I'm the facilitator of the course. I work part of the Safe Schools Project in Santa Cruz, and also I'm a consultant with the Our Family Coalition and the Santa Cruz County Office of Education, and I'm running these cohorts in both Santa Clara County and Monterey County. So the ongoing website, I will send the slides after this, and you are welcome to click on some of those resources there, various resources that may relate to some of this. I just included the Harlem Renaissance a little bit there, even though we're not going to really talk about it, because that may help you in seeing how all these things work together. So our webinar structure is that I'm going to give this background, then I'm going to check in and have each one of you introduce yourselves, and then I'll record the first part and not the second part. So here's the first part. Remember, our next webinar will be on March 31st. We're going to focus more on legislation, laws, and amendments related to that stuff, to LGBT history. Just a friendly reminder that consider this a safe space. The pink triangle denotes that, and know that in your own classrooms with who you are, what you do, just showing some safe space symbol is helpful for students. If you remember when we talked in our workshop, we talked about key historical statements or questions that, depending on who you're talking about in history, you can say things like, evidence indicates that, or if somebody was alive today, would he, she, or they identify as gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender? For example, from the Harlem Renaissance, we could say if Ma Rainey were alive today, would she have identified as bisexual? Or if we were talking about Charlie Parkhurst, if Charlie Parkhurst were alive today, would he have identified as transgender? So those are all questions and ways to answer those questions. So remember, we talked about social movements and how all these social movements are intertwined together. And I'm just putting that little visual there as a reminder that we talked about how general US history, LGBT rights, Latinx rights, African American rights, all those happen at similar times in history. So it wasn't just these movements happening, but there was this broader consciousness among people in the United States to speak out and basically, you know, move towards greater rights for everybody. So the 1920s were a time, the Harlem Renaissance following the Civil War, was really a time that increased LGBT visibility and acceptance. After the Civil War, more Americans lived in cities than farms for the first time. There were more wealth in the cities. African American people moved from the South to the North into many of the big cities, New York being one of them. That is one of the reasons that the Harlem Renaissance developed the way it did. So that's kind of our point of contact, the 1920s. The 1950s were a time that decreased LGBT visibility and acceptance. Post-World War II, the GI Bill provided education and mortgages. There was a baby boom. The McCarthy anti-communism era, also known as the Lavender Scare, happened there along with the Cold War. And then following that, the Civil Rights Movement developed, of which part of that were LGBT people, but mostly it was around African-American people and that sort of thing. So those are just kind of markers of dates so that you have that in mind as I talk about this other part. We call it the other war, or queerness in World War II. Michael Bronski wrote this book called A Queer History of the United States. And he says, it's impossible to overestimate the effect of World War II on American culture, and in particular on lesbian and gay men. That's how he wrote it, but it should have been lesbians and gays. But anyway, the idea, you know, during World War II, females were concentrated in factories to build supplies for the war, while men went off to war and found themselves in other countries that were more inclusive and more inclusive of people with same-sex relationships. So that's where World War II came in, and those kinds of experiences developed because of World War II and the way things worked. So both men and women were encouraged to work and lived in strictly gender segregated communities. And as a result of that, then it allowed queer people opportunities to better understand who they were for the first time. Even though homosexuality was officially banned in the military, it doesn't mean that there were not, you know, same-sex desires or interests between same-sex people. There were only about 5,000 of the 18 million people who were drafted that were turned away for being homosexuals. Drafted into World War II, there were psychological tests and certain questions were asked, and if the individuals answered certain questions a certain way, then they were not accepted in the military. But if you recall World War II, it was a time where there was a great need for people in World War II to fight for the United States. So some of those things were not strictly enforced because it helped. The webinar link says 5. Let me pause this a minute. All right, so we were talking about military service in World War II. Some historians argue that the war helped to build urban gay life versus gay bars and drag clubs because of the kind of the transient party culture that often accompanied military service. One gay service member remembered that was told to try to enjoy things because who knows what you might be sent tomorrow. So one lesbian member recalled how women all looked like butch in their uniforms, which helped her and other butch women feel more at ease interacting with each other as well. So that's World War II. You know, people of color were likely to receive a discharge from the military more often for homosexual activity than, or insubordination than other people. Queer bars also created during that time often excluded queer people of color. And then, you know, there were gay men who also were interned in Japanese internment camps. So that was kind of what happened to some of the LGBT people as well. But following the war, many queer service people stayed in large cities. Part of the reason they stayed in large cities is because when they were discharged in larger cities, and they'd been away from their families at that point, and in some cases started having same-sex relationships. So that's part of the reason that lots of people stayed in San Francisco in that area, because there were large discharge centers in the larger cities. So that's part of the reason that people ended up where they did, and kind of continued on with the life that they'd gotten used to. So at the same time, after World War II was this thing called the Lavender Scare, and the government really set the stage for that, because in 1918 there was a Sedition Act that said you can't criticize the government. And so if you couldn't criticize the government, then if somebody kicked you out of government, you couldn't respond necessarily. This Attorney General Mitchell Palmer's house got bombed by anarchists, and he responded by rounding up radicals and immigrants, and those radicals and immigrants often included LGBTQ people. And the person in charge of those was J. Edgar Hoover, who had just been hired by the FBI. And I know, I think in our workshop we pointed out that there's some evidence that suggests J. Edgar Hoover was gay, but not in his business life, so to speak. So here's McCarthy in a speech about communists, but at the same time, a congressional report came out that talked about employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in government. The report said, in the opinion of this subcommittee, homosexuals and other sex perverts are not proper persons to be employed in the government for 2 reasons. First, they are generally unsuitable, and second, they constitute security risks. So that was a report in 1950. 52, an Immigration Act barred people from that were afflicted by psychopathic personality issues, which included homosexuals and sex perverts, which that same law was in place in 1967, which impacted the Supreme Court case called Boutilier versus Immigration and Naturalization, which was based on this law that happened in 1952. Eisenhower gets elected in 53 and issues this executive order based off of that report, which basically says anybody with criminal, infamous, dishonest, immoral, or notoriously disgraceful conduct should be released. And the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover ran with that. they had these code words, right? These were the code words for homosexual people: sexual deviance, security risk, moral weakness, or shady characters. Those were all terms that were used in the 50s, which implied homosexual people or LGBTQ people, and they did their best to kick him out of the government. And the term Lavender Scare developed because of a historian going back and looking at this time period, and that's what he named it, was the Lavender Scare. Also during this time period, there was what were called blue discharges or blue tickets. People who had these homosexual proclivities got a blue discharge, which meant they were not honorably nor dishonorably discharged. They were just discharged. The negative part of that was they did not have access to veteran benefits or the GI Bill after World War II. There's evidence that suggests as many 5,000 people were received a blue discharge or blue ticket, which kind of put them in this limbo of having been in the military but not really getting the benefits from the military. So that went on at the same time. So one of the heroes of this time period was Frank Kameny, and I bring him to your attention. I may have shared this with you before, but Frank eventually got hired by the U.S. Army Map Service in the government, but shortly after the executive order in 10450, he was found out, and people said that he had engaged in homosexual affairs, of which Kameny did not admit or say one thing either way. He filed the first lawsuit based on sexual orientation with the Supreme Court. He did it all himself. The lawsuit was filed by him and it was dismissed. As a result of that, he formed the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C. to advocate for gay people. That's his picture there, holding the gay is good sign. He had very organized groups and that sort of thing. So Frank Kameny kind of grew from this, and his activism helped overturn the American Psychological Association's definition of homosexuality. It led eventually to the overturning of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which happened many years later. He continued, following his dismissal, to advocate for LGBTQ people in a variety of ways, and he was a very active writer. He wrote letters all the time, and many of his papers and things he wrote, he was also a pack rat, so he kept everything he did. So after he passed away, all his papers were donated to the Library of Congress, and so it went up on somebody's business to sort through all the papers that were left behind. But within that were many examples of his advocacy work along with other people as a result of what happened with the Lavender Scare. So that pretty much covers a little bit of the background about World War II, Lavender Scare, and how that all fits together in the time period that many people teach in US history. So at that point, I'm going to stop the recording.